So, I would like to talk just briefly about the idea of who wrote Mozart's Requiem. That might seem like a really silly statement to make. Obviously, Mozart wrote Mozart's Requiem. Yes and no. Um, it is famously unfinished at the time of his death. You know, the myths say he gets to the seventh bar of the Lacrimosa and just stops and dies at that point, which is not exactly what happened. Um, so what does exist that is Mozart? We know that the introit and the Kyrie were completed orchestrationally, vocally, orchestrationally, and that's essentially the part that is the most Mozart, actual Mozart. After that, it follows kind of Mozart's practice of writing the vocal lines out, chorus parts, the solo parts, the bass line, and the figured harmonization, the notation that indicates what the harmony is to the bass line. And that we have complete through what would be called the sequence, which is the Dies Irae, through the Lacrimosa, the next part of the Requiem Mass itself. Um, in addition to the vocal parts and the bass line and the harmonic figuration, we have some little indications of reminders to himself, like, oh yeah, I'd like the violins to do this here, and I'd like, the clarinets to do this here, bass and horns. Um, I'd like this little orchestration detail here, etc. Just kind of like mnemonic devices to when he was going to go back and fill out the orchestration, he was reminding himself as he was composing through, oh yeah, this is what I want to do here. This was kind of standard practice for Mozart, so this is not unusual. It's just what's unusual is he did not live to do that rest of that process, nor did he live to give us the vocal sketches and the bass line and the harmony for three movements: the Sanctus, the Benedictus, and the Agnus Dei. Those movements we have no sketches for that exist. Probably the only real piece of sketch that kind of exists that is in sort of fragmentary form is the Amen fugue at the end of the Lacrimosa, which would have been typical because you from a liturgical standpoint you wanted to end each of the major sections with a fugue. So where the finished Lacrimosa that's come down to us from Süssmayr, and we'll get to Süssmayr in a moment, is just a simple Amen. Mozart actually sketched a pretty extensive fugue, which either Süssmayr didn't have access to or didn't feel competent to complete, so he just simply put Amen at the end of that. And that's where the piece stood when Mozart died. The question of finishing the piece was crucially important to his wife Constanza because it meant money, quite frankly, which she was in desperate need of at that point. And the first part of the commission had been paid, so sort of like the advance to the commission had been paid. But in order to get the completion of it, she would have had to deliver to the commissioner, this Count von Walsegg, who commissioned works from famous composers of the day and then tried to pass them off as his own pieces, which is why the mysterious messenger, all of this kind of from lore and from legend comes from. It was just Count von Walsegg just trying to make sure that he could try and pass it off as his own piece. But in order to get the money, the remainder of the commission, she would have had to deliver a completed score. So the problem then was, oh my God, how do I figure out how to complete the score? So she turned to various associate students of Mozart's, Joseph Eibler, and others, to try and complete the work. And Eibler started. He tried. You can see in the autograph manuscript, you can see the different inks. You can see the different hands of various people that tried to finish the work, but ultimately, most people just kind of tossed their hands up and said, I can't do this. And she finally turned to Franz Xavier Zismayer, another student of Mozart's, one that Mozart didn't think particularly highly of, not a incredibly distinguished composer, but competent, and who had a kind of a hand writing that sort of looked a little bit like Mozart, so she could probably make it work. She could pull off the deception. And Zismayer, at the very least, went through and said, "Okay, I will complete this work." We know he was involved with Mozart while Mozart was composing the work, and he set about not only finishing and completing the orchestrations of the existing movements that Mozart had left the vocal part and the bass line and the harmony indications for, but also the missing movements, which were the Sanctus, the Benedictus, and the Agnus Dei, allegedly all his own composition. He somehow decided, whether Mozart told him to do this or whether he decided on his own, to kind of create a big secular return to the beginning by using the music from the beginning, from the Lux Aeterna for the closing fugue. So basically replicating the Requiem Introit and the Kyrie fugue with the Lux Aeterna and the Cum Sancto fugue. That then was a kind of a completion. And we don't know that he had access to any material that doesn't currently exist. Although I like to maintain that the Benedictus is so Mozartian. There's so much feels Mozart about it. The melodic construct, that if he didn't have access to material for that movement from Mozart, it was the best day of composition Zismayer ever had in his life, because the Benedictus in the Zismayer version is very Mozartian. So then Constanze was able to complete the commission and get the money. And the Requiem came down to us in this version, the Zismayer version, the Zismayer completion. It was pretty quickly understood that it was Zismayer who completed it. It was obvious to everyone that it wasn't completely Mozart. And while people complained about Zismayer's additions and clumsiness and compositionally and all of that kind of thing, it was what it was, and it was the only way we could get this last work of Mozart's until the 20th century, and then we have, particularly in the late 20th century, we have a number of attempts to kind of toss out Zismayer. First to correct Zismayer, then to toss out Zismayer, to create more historically accurate, if you want to think about it, musicologically accurate completions of the work, and the various and sundry musicologists and musicians who tried to do that and created various versions. So now there are multiple versions of the end of the completion of the work. So the question is, why do we want to complete it? And why can't we just accept what Zismayer wrote? We know why Constanze wanted it completed, because she needed the money. That was pretty obvious. But why do we here in 2026 still feel like the efforts of the last 50 years to recomplete it and to try again and to finish? Why do we want to do that? We don't think anything of looking at the torso of the Venus de Milo, and you don't want to add arms, the Winged Victory of Samothrace, these other things, other works that are incomplete. Charles Dickens' Mystery of Edwin Drood. There are a couple of people who've tried to finish the story, but most people are content to sort of leave it as a mystery, like it's just incomplete. Classical music has a problem with that. we're constantly trying to sort of like, it's like we want just a little bit more. We can't quite accept that somebody died without finishing their last great statement. It's kind of why people have attempted to finish the Bruckner Ninth Symphony, why people have tried to finish Schubert's quote unquote unfinished symphony. We have Mahler 10th Symphony. We have the Elgar Third Symphony. All of these pieces, we've it's almost like this compulsion in classical music to finish the master's last great work that remains unfinished, and to take the sketches and create something. The great what ifs of music history. Perhaps that's it. I'm not sure. But we do have this tradition in classical music of trying to finish unfinished works. And I love the idea of what was commissioned about 12 years ago or so from Gregory Spears, a wonderful composer that has done amazing works. His opera Fellow Travelers is stunning, is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year with a major tour. He's writing new operas. He just had a premiere in Philadelphia, Sleeper's Wake. Greg is a wonderful composer, but he was asked to finish Mozart's Requiem by providing new movements, taking Süssmayr, not fixing Süssmayr up through the end of the Lacrimosa, just accepting that is what it is, but taking then the Sanctus, the Benedictus, and the Agnus Dei, and saying, you know what, those really aren't Mozart. Although Greg and I have talked about this, and the Benedictus in particular feels Mozart, and he did take a motive from there as a inspiration for his own movement. But basically composed 3 new movements. 21st century composer, steeped in the Mozart Requiem, steeped in earlier music, understanding, but yet responding, not trying to replicate Mozart, but responding from a 21st century perspective to Mozart's Requiem with these 3 movements, which he did brilliantly. And I think when you hear it, it's going to be quite astonishing to see how the response actually works beautifully with the original 18th century work. But this is our 21st century way of completing this work. Not necessarily taking Mozart's sketches and rewriting them or filling them out, as many musicologists have done in the late 20th century to quote unquote complete the work, but to respond to it from a creative standpoint, from a composer in the 21st century, and saying, well, I understand Mozart, I've studied Mozart, I studied all of this, I understand the spirit of the piece, but I'm going to write my own music. The brilliance of the music, I think, is most encapsulated in the Agnus Dei, because how do you end it if you don't do what Süssmayr did and go back to Mozart? It's kind of it sort of feels then tacked on at the end instead of something that's a response, and then we end the way we expect we're going to end, which is the Lux Aeterna and the Cum Sancta with Mozart. So he did exactly that. We get to the end of his movement of the Agnus Dei, and little by little, fragments of chord progressions, fragments of motives that clearly then remind us, oh, wait a minute. I recognize that. It's bits and pieces of Süssmayr's Agnus Dei giving us the transition and the modulations to where we need to be for Mozart to come back. And so what happens at the end of the Agnus Dei is that fragmentarily and little by little by little, from the 21st century, the mists of the 18th century return, and suddenly we're back to Mozart. I personally think this is a brilliant way to respond to the piece, to complete the work in a way that feels creative from a 21st century perspective, and at the same time deeply respectful of the original Mozart Requiem and Süssmayer's efforts to bring the piece to fruition and completion, and yet at the same time honoring the idea of coming back to Mozart at the end. So we begin with Mozart, we end with Mozart. We have a beautiful response in the latter third of the piece by a contemporary composer, and ultimately he takes us back and gives the last word back to Mozart. I love the idea of giving the last word to Mozart, and I think that that's a great way of approaching this. I think you will find it's an extraordinary journey through the piece in this way, and you can come to your own conclusions as to whether or not the piece needs to be completed. Does it need to be completed? I don't know. I think it's nice if it's completed. I usually, quite frankly, prefer Süssmayer's completion if I'm going to do the traditional completion, just partially because I like the idea of an 18th century musician who knew Mozart, even if he wasn't that great a composer. There's something about the fact that he was in that time, as opposed to a brilliant 20th century musicologist who, and there are many of them who have done completions that are wonderful and beautiful, and even to the point of rewriting the fugue that Mozart started for the end of the Lacrimosa, that Süssmayer didn't even touch. All of those things are wonderful, but there's still 200 years of music history between them and Mozart. And so I think if you're going to do a completed version, this is a wonderful way to do it. Have a 21st century composer recompose just his own response for those movements for which Mozart, we think, left no sketches and left no information. Up to you to decide whether or not that little fragment that comes in the Benedictus that he uses, that Greg uses from Süssmayer, and the transition back in the Agnus Dei from Süssmayer. I leave it to you to decide whether or not maybe there's some little germ of Mozart that somehow wafts through until we finally get to the final statement with Mozart. I hope you enjoy the Requiem.